I definitely think that I can't imagine like family members whose loved ones have disappeared and they have nothing and I don't know how they live with that, or they have a family member who died a violent death and they don't know who did it or why, or I don't know how they live with that. I tend to try not to think too much about that because I don't want it. You have to kind of protect your own emotions as
Mhm.
well. But I don't know how. And so I really do focus on, I just want to get the person and make them pay for what they did or help and assist in some way. And I want to know as well. I have this desire to know things and who did this, why they do it, and they need to be held accountable. So that's a really a strong motivating factor for me getting into law enforcement. But yeah, it bothers me quite a bit. And certainly I mean the thought of being able to provide answers to families is great, but in terms of when I'm a profiler, I don't have those relationships with the families.
That's Julia Cowley, a retired FBI profiler. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. Julia is a retired FBI agent and criminal profiler. She spent 22 years in the FBI investigating violent crime, including 11 years as an agent and a decade more as a member of the famed Behavioral Analysis Unit, or BAU. Julia makes no bones about the fact that true crime is what led her towards forensic science and law enforcement. Prior to joining the FBI, Julia was a special agent and forensic scientist with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. She has a bachelor's degree in chemistry from the University of Oregon and a master's degree in forensic science from George Washington University. At the BAU, Julia was the lead profiler on the East Area Rapist and Original Night Stalker cases that were eventually merged into what is now known as the Golden State Killer case. She worked on the case of serial killer Israel Keys in the early stages of the Long Island serial killer case. She's also had other assignments in the FBI investigating white-collar crime, public corruption, civil rights matters, and other topics in the Boston field office. Julia is also the host of her own podcast, The Consult, a true crime podcast that examines behavior that occurs before, during, and after the commission of a criminal act. Julia's brought retired FBI profilers together on the show to explore cases they've worked on and conduct analysis of others, including the disappearance of Mason City, Iowa television anchor Jody Husenart, and an analysis of the JonBenet Ramsey case ransom note. The BIU is a highly competitive part of the already highly competitive agency's Investigations and Operations section in its Critical Incident Response Group. Popularized by television shows like Mindhunter and Criminal Minds, and books and movies like The Silence of the Lambs, the BAU is well known for its study of serial killers, its classification of offenders connected to certain types of crime scenes, and a part of high-profile investigations like the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, the investigation of the killing of JonBenet Ramsey, and the murder of 4 college students at the University of Idaho. Today, we're going to talk about the true lives of criminal profilers, what they do and don't do, how they can support law enforcement in cases, and the art and science of behavioral analysis. We are also going to discuss some specific cases, including the murder of 13-year-old Taylor Platcher Plackle and 11-year-old Skyla Whitaker, and answer listeners' questions along the way. This 2-part episode was a part of a live that was aired on February 17th for members of our Patreon community. So I'll go ahead and get us started. I'll just go ahead and introduce you. For those of you guys who are on live and who are listening, this is my friend and one of my favorite people, Julia Cowley. and my true crime texting buddy. Uh, Julia is a retired FBI agent and criminal profiler. She spent 22 years in the FBI, investigated violent crime, white collar crime, worked in evidence response, and was on the famed behavioral analysis unit. Julia is also the host of her own podcast. I don't want to call it exactly a true crime podcast, but it is. It's called The Consult. And one of the things that I really love about The Consult is it gives you an opportunity to see what it's really truly like to be in the room during a consult that the BAU might give to law enforcement. Before working at the FBI, Julia worked at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigations, where she was a forensic scientist. She's a graduate of the University of Oregon, has a master's degree in forensic science from George Washington University. Let's see if I can get this right. And then, Julia's worked on some really cool cases along the way. What's known as the Golden State Killer, also the East Area Rapist, same case. The Long Island serial killer case, a couple other really interesting ones. And on her podcast, The Consult, they've done a lot of really cool episodes in my mind on lesser known cases, but also big cases Julia didn't work on, like the analysis you guys recently did on the John Benet Ramsey ransom note, which was fascinating and had lots of ideas I had never seen or heard before. So today, part of what we're going to do is we're going to have a conversation. Julia's been on 3 times. She'll probably be on 300 before I end the podcast, but about, hey, about sort of like what is the real role of a profiler? What kind of work do they do? How do they support investigations? And maybe talk about some of those cases, including, I think, two, that I think, at least I find very touching, the murders of Skylar Whitaker and Taylor Paschal Placker in Oklahoma, and then also the unsolved murder of Phil DiMartino, which, hopefully some of the conversations about that can help lead to resolution. But I wanted to start off, just with sort of a basic question about what behavioral analysis is, and sort of like whether you consider it science or it's something else, and how does it contribute to investigations as opposed to the way it's depicted on television.
Mm-hmm. Well, behavioral analysis is also known as criminal profiling. And in the FBI, while we're assigned to the behavioral analysis unit, the product we produce and what we do is called a criminal investigative analysis, which is typically what people call a profile. But that's the official definition. And I think to many people, what that means is we're coming up with a profile of an unknown offender. There's been a crime and we want to know what kind of person did it. And so we are going to come up with those personality traits and characteristics. But a criminal investigative analysis can be so much more. It's an entire process. And it's funny, I was recently texting with another true crime podcast host who had covered a case, a missing persons case, and the person is believed to have been killed. But I had done the profile on that case, and they just did a great job of the coverage. And the host had asked me, how long did it take to come up with the profile? And I said, I looked back and like it took about 4 months to come up with the profile. And that was one single case. But it's really a very comprehensive process.
It's not like a day, like it is on Criminal Minds. Not a day.
I wish. I mean, that's funny because people will ask me questions about a case. They'll give me like basic facts. They'll say, "Oh, do you know this case? What do you think?" And they are always very disappointed when I say, "I don't know." Like, so sometimes my husband will watch Dateline with me, and he'll be like, "Well, what do you think?" Right at the beginning, I'm like, "I don't know," and he'll be, "What good are you? What good are you?"
Why do I keep you around?
So, but it is a very long process. And it's not just looking at the case one time. Sometimes you're asking for additional information. But You're examining things, you're evaluating things, you're interpreting things, all from a behavioral perspective, not from the investigative perspective, not from the forensic perspective. Obviously, we take all that into account, but this is just looking at all the behavior, given all the facts that are available to you, the circumstances, the evidence, the actions that are exhibited before, during, and after the commission of a criminal act.
And you're
So,
not, are you just looking at the behavior of the offender or?
no, not just the behavior of the offender, but you're also looking at the victimology, the behavior of the victim and the victims. I mean, you're trying to get an entire picture of that particular victim and how they would have acted or behaved or responded in certain situations.
So
And your
really looking at the combination of all the.
combination. And the, there's a lot of different things that behavioral analysis or criminal investigative analysis can provide. And it's not just a profile of an unknown offender. We get called into a lot of different cases, and we're starting to highlight those on our show. But interview strategies for people, whether they're the offenders or suspects or witnesses or even victims. We do victim questionnaires as well to try to draw out more information from victims. We would do media strategies, statement analysis, threat assessments. So
So
there's a lot of different things, a lot of different ways that behavioral analysis can assist in a case. And it's really not, and you were talking about, is it a hard science, soft science? And it really is a very soft science, I would say. But you draw from things, you draw from your experience, you draw from your investigative experience, and not just my own investigative experience, but the investigative experience of my colleagues who are part of this process. No one person can do it. You need to have input from a lot of different people, perspectives, backgrounds. We all have a little bit of knowledge of psychology, and we all have different backgrounds. And for example, my background is, forensics and chemistry. So I do have that hard science background that I bring to the process. But then I might have another colleague who has a completely different background that can bring it to to this whole process that we participate in. It's a service that we provide to law enforcement that are looking for more assistance. And
I was just curious, what kind of backgrounds do they look for? Allison Dixon just dropped in the chat. She mentioned that, you know, profiling was one of her dream jobs since the point that she saw Silence of the Lambs. And I
same.
remember,
I love that
yeah,
movie.
yeah. I remember having a conversation about that one night, and I was saying, which movies are more realistic? And you said, actually, that one is. And also, wasn't your friend an extra in that?
Yeah, she was in the boxing scene and another scene. She was a new agent trainee at the time they were filming. And I would say I actually don't think it's all that accurate. There are parts
Right.
that are accurate. I mean, certainly there's some authenticity to it because they filmed at Quantico, and a lot of the extras were actual FBI agents, just like my former colleague who was an extra in it at the academy, and instructors were also part of the movie. So there's some authenticity to it, but and it's based on some the serial killer in that case is a composite of multiple real serial killers. And
Ed
so
Gein and yeah,
yeah, but certainly no new agent trainee would be out in the field
interviewing. Right.
interviewing a serial killer. No way. I mean, that takes years and years. And so I think some people at the time, I think that was a big draw, kind of like Top Gun. After Top Gun, a bunch of people wanted to go join the Navy and fly planes. But it's the same thing. I think that was a great recruiting tool at the time. But I think there was a misconception that I can just walk in and become a profiler. And it's not like that. You have to at least 10 years as a case agent investigating different violations in a in an office. It's just a special agent. I don't want to say just a special agent, but you have to start at the very beginning and develop your investigative skills as an FBI agent before you can even apply to the BAU.
So when I was covering law enforcement and covering the FBI, I think there were about 12,000, 13,000, something like that total. I can't remember whether it was agents or employees. How many profilers? How many out of that group are actually profilers?
Maybe 30.
Okay. So
It's expanded since I was there, but there's probably more, maybe 30 to 50, what we would term certified profilers. And those are the people that are selected to be in one of the units. And there's different units. I was in the crimes against adults unit, but they have a crimes against children unit. They have terrorism. They now have a cyber unit. They have a research unit as well. So I think there's 5 units now. So I'm not really sure how many. If I had to say, probably maximum 50
right.
certified profilers currently working for the FBI now all over the country. In the there's 56 field offices of the FBI all over the country, and you have what are called coordinators. They're the BAU coordinators, and they're agents that are at the local in the the local field office, that are the liaisons between the BAU and state and local law enforcement in their area of responsibility. So they all have some training. They're not profilers, but they have a little bit of training, and they can get additional training as well. And they understand the process. They know what a profiler would need in order to provide a criminal investigative analysis to an agency. So you have a number of those, because you could have multiple coordinators in a certain office. And I was, prior to becoming a profiler, I was the coordinator, one of the coordinators in the Boston
What
division.
was what was your path to get there? I mean, how did you even get into forensic science? Was that your were you I know you were in Oregon, Tennessee's kind of far from what was your path to become a forensic?
So my path was, I knew I wanted to be a forensic scientist, and that's why I majored in chemistry. And back at that time, the late 80s, they didn't really have forensic science programs as we know them now. Now there are a lot of schools offer those, but they didn't have it. And I was, just financially kind of limited to stay at a state school. And so I luckily I wanted to go to the University of Oregon. That was my dream school anyway. So I make the most of things. I see the good in everything. So my dream school, University of Oregon, and I majored in chemistry, thinking, well, I liked chemistry, believe it or not, but thinking that would give me the most opportunity to be able to work in a crime lab, because most of the disciplines in the crime lab draw upon the fundamentals of chemistry or biology. And I liked chemistry better than biology. So I majored in chemistry knowing I wanted to work in a crime lab. And then after I graduated, I went to grad school, as you mentioned, at George Washington University. And I moved to Washington, D.C., and I spent about a year and a half getting my master's degree, which was really fun. It was much easier to get a forensic science degree than the chemistry degree, because once I was in forensic science, I was just applying the chemistry, and
Chemistry to
I
something.
had some legal classes as well. And I took a forensic medicine class at the DC medical examiner's office. And so I absolutely loved it. And I loved Washington, DC. So I did that. And then before when I was getting ready to finish my master's degree, I started to apply to different crime labs all over the country, everywhere, because the jobs are few and far between. And usually you have to apply to the state and get on a state registry, and then you get ranked, and it can take a really long time. So after grad school, I worked for about a year in a biotech lab,
Oh,
for a biotech company out in California. After that, I just remember one morning I got a phone call, went out for an interview to Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. I went to Nashville. I'd never been to Tennessee before, did the interview. And then a couple months later, I got a phone call that they were going to hire me. And I guess my boss, who the one of the people who interviewed me, who later became my boss, I guess, told everyone that girl from California is never coming here. So
She's never actually going to come here. Why would?
he's like, she'll never come. Like, she's from California. But I rented a Ford Taurus, packed all my belongings into the Ford Taurus, and drove from California to Nashville and did my training there. And I did my training in Nashville, was ultimately assigned to the Knoxville crime lab because I could also be a member of the evidence response team, or we called them violent crime team, or violent crime response teams at TBI back at that time. I don't know if they still call them that, but I knew I could be not only a forensic scientist in the laboratory, but also be responding to crime scenes and processing those. And that's what I really wanted to do as well. So then I had a colleague who was a mentor to me, and he applied to the FBI a couple years before I did, and he got in. And after being in the lab for a few years, I started to feel like I wanted to work my own cases rather than being like this small part. I felt like it was a very small part of these cases, but I wanted to be an investigator. I wanted to investigate murder at some point in my career. So I decided to apply to the FBI, and I was fortunate enough to be accepted.
And from there, were you a coordinator before you went to the BAU?
Yes. So I was assigned after I graduated the FBI Academy. I was assigned to the Boston division. Again, I'd only been to Boston on a vacation before, so I was kind of a fish out of water in Boston, and I was assigned to bank fraud. And I thought, I don't want to do bank fraud. I'm a violent crime person. But, honestly, again, going back to, some people think you're going to walk into the FBI and just get to do whatever you want. That is not the case. So I was very much aware that you do not have a choice when you join the FBI, at least not right away, and you are going to get assigned wherever they need you.
Were you thinking about being a profiler as you came in?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Oh, yes. I wanted to be
Did people tell
profiler.
you were crazy?
Well, yes. I was very much aware that the chances of becoming a profiler, whether I got into the FBI or not, were very slim. And when I was in graduate school, we did have an FBI agent come talk to a group of students, which I attended, and somebody had asked him, what are the chances of becoming an FBI profiler? And he said 0. Like, don't think you're coming into the FBI to be a profiler. And, I know what he was saying.
That doesn't seem right.
Well, that's what I thought to myself, my keen scientific mind, like,
yes, right.
That can't be 0. That doesn't match up. So, but I understood what he was saying. Don't come in, you're going to be very disappointed if you come in thinking I'm going to do this, this, and this. You really do have to kind of take what they give you. And so I was assigned to bank fraud, and I didn't really have about any kind of, obviously I took some math in college, but I wasn't really a banker, and I didn't understand. I had to learn the violation. I had to learn to work cases, and I was disappointed at first, but looking back, I realized it was the best thing for me. I learned how to really work, detailed cases, document intensive cases. I met my best friend in the bureau. We sat next to each other. She's still one of my dearest friends. How can I regret that? And so, and I just kept my head down. A lot of people will come into the bureau and they get assigned something that they don't like, and all they do is sit around and complain about it. And who's going to want to work with you? What supervisor is going to say, I want that person on my squad, if all they do is complain? So, I just kept my head down, did some really good work, and then they were going to be disbanding my squad. And so they were going to actually not disbanding, but combining my squad with another squad's, and not everybody was going to be able to stay. So a few of us were going to get transferred. And I didn't ask to go anywhere. I thought, well, if they keep me, then great. If I get transferred, then we'll just see what happens. And I was selected by the supervisor of the Public Corruption Civil Rights Squad, who had felt he had some good interactions working with me in a couple of other cases where we had some overlap. And he requested that if you're going to get rid of anybody, I want this agent. And so I went to that squad, Public Corruption Civil Rights, and I stayed there until I went to BAU. And it was the greatest work that I
Yeah.
did. And even though it was white collar, which you wouldn't necessarily think would translate to the BAU, there was so much variety. And I really, my time on the bank fraud squad, my time on the public corruption, civil rights, I learned how to be a really good investigator
How to work the case, right?
how to work good cases, how complex cases, how to put things together. And it wasn't just all white collar. There was some violent crime. I did some drug cases that involved public officials. So I did get some violent crime experience. And of course, this whole time, I'm also part of the evidence response team. So I'm still keeping up my skills there. And, by the time, it's just sometimes timing, you can get really lucky. But when I applied to the BAU, they were, I don't want to say under pressure, but they were under some pressure to develop in the Crimes Against Adults unit, develop more of a white collar program within the Crimes Against Adults. Yeah, so it really benefited me at the time to have that white collar background. So when I joined the unit, I was not only working the violent crime cases, but I was working with my colleague Susan, who's on the consult, Susan Kostler, and she was in charge of the white collar program. We were doing research into high level white collar offenders, and she was spearheading that, and I was part of that. And we were starting to get in white collar cases that we would provide interview strategies on. And so it was kind of a combination. So I think, my combination of having this violent crime and white collar background really benefited me at the time. And sometimes it's all about the timing and it worked out very well for me. And so that was my path.
Yeah, it just makes me think, bringing up the white collar piece of it. And one of the things, thinking about like such a small unit, such a specialized unit, what is sort of like the criteria for the types of cases that the BAU gets brought into? Because I know a lot of sort of profiling in the quote unquote sense, the general sense, has to do with statistics, right? We know that certain percentage of, if X happens, Y happens, or, the family's the first place that you look. So I can't imagine those are the cases where you bring in the BAU. I would imagine it's the cases where, the stats don't always pan out, or it's a complete whodunit, or what is the criteria? How do they accept cases?
I just remember we accepted almost every case that we could, because sometimes even when you have the statistics, you might want an interview strategy for somebody because you don't have the evidence. Like statistically, if somebody dies in the home, probably somebody in the family killed them. So the law enforcement may know exactly who did it, and they just may not have it. So they want maybe an interview strategy. So there's no one set criteria, and I'm not aware. I wasn't the one. I guess there was a time where too I was actually acting unit chief, so I did have to make decisions about cases and who they get assigned to. But I'm not aware of anyone who ever came to our unit, at least when I was there, that asked for help that was turned away in some way. But sometimes, Jason, people will ask for something and we'll look at it and we'll say, we really can't do that, but maybe this is what you need, or maybe we can provide this instead. So we'll maybe guide them in a way that we think would be more useful for what, the kind of case that they have. But, we would look at cases where it seemed very obvious who did it. And maybe the police or the investigators are just looking for a fresh set of eyes, some new ideas, some strategies to try to bring closure.
It's funny. In all my reporting days, covering places like the ATF, the FBI, NYPD, and whoever. I never really tripped across I trip across the fact that the BAU was involved in something after the fact or something like that. But the only time I actually tripped across BAU was in actually covering a case. It was BAU agents who were serving as jury consultants for the prosecution. And I was like, this is wild. They're actually helping them, as a part of and it just really sort of made me think much more broadly about what
Right.
BAU.
And that's another thing we had done. This is before my time, but there were agents in the Crimes Against Children's Unit that had served as jury consultants for the Michael Jackson trial.
I didn't know.
And I served as one on another a high profile case in Washington, D.C. as well. And there was a mistrial in that. But so that's another service that could be provided. Prosecution strategies. I mean, how are you going to present this case? How are you going to, what's the motive? And so there's a lot of different ways to utilize the services of the BAU.
And I know you've worked on some cool cases, at least in my mind, many that aren't the biggest cases. I find them all pretty fascinating, but I know you worked on Long Island serial killer case, the Joe D'Angelo case, which I know goes by many different names, the Israel Keys case, and just curious about what kind of role you guys played in that case or those cases. I imagine it was different for all of them, or different, certainly different agencies and relationships. But what kind
Yeah.
of investigative support did you have?
Well, I think in the Golden State Killer case, and it wasn't called that at the time, we didn't know who had done it either. So I called it the East Area Rapist Original Night Stalker. So the ear. And that was just developing a profile of the offender, what type of person were they looking for, and providing investigative suggestions and just overall impressions, linkage analysis on that case, linking, first of all, were all the offenses linked together or not? Because sometimes if you have a series going on and any crime that happens or any violence that occurs, they'll attribute it to a single offender, and sometimes they're not connected. So it was looking at all the offenses to see, are they all connected, and then connecting a series, the Visalia series, to the Sacramento. So there was a lot there. Now with the Long Island serial killer, I do want to say that we were involved very early on, the very early stages, and we did not continue to be involved. I don't think any FBI continued to be involved past very early stages. And so it was very preliminary, and it was developing, a profile and characteristics. And I should say we weren't working with all the information that they developed over time. So we didn't have everything at the time. So it was very preliminary. And what was the other case you had asked about? Israel Keys.
Mhm.
So those, we were involved in two different cases. The couriers who were abducted by Israel Keys from their home in Vermont, and we were doing an assessment of that, trying to we did a lot of victimology and really just trying to determine, are they alive or dead? Did they leave on their own accord? Is this, an abduction? What kind of person would have abducted them? We were providing a lot of investigative suggestions. And then later when he offended in Alaska and took Samantha out of the kiosk, kidnapped her out of the kiosk, we were involved almost right away.
Mhm.
And so it was all real time. We were gathering
Were
information.
you guys shocked or surprised? Was it the same group of profilers working on both of those cases, or were you surprised
Yes.
when you found out?
No, we were, so those of us that do the consult, Bob, Susan, and I, we were involved in both of them.
Mm.
And We had other different people, but the three of us were involved. And Bob was the lead profiler on the couriers. None of us were the lead on Samantha Koenig, but we were all very involved in that. And that was a lot of investigative suggestions. It was a lot of you need to find out everything we can about Samantha. Just everything that we would advise early on in an investigation to make sure that they're getting. And of course, then the offender who was, identified as Israel Keys started communicating with the family, and we were involved in that, and through all of it. And then when he was interviewed, we found out he was confessing to murdering the couriers. And I would say that was probably the most shocked I was in
Yeah.
my career at the BAU, is to find out that those were connected. I mean, it was there's just looking. I think we've been asked before. We're actually participating in a documentary on the case, the three of us, and the case. It's on Israel Keys, and the entire story is being told through the eyes of all law enforcement that was involved. So it'll be a very interesting perspective. But one of the preliminary questions they asked, were you guys surprised, or did it? And we're like, yes. I mean, never. It was jaw dropping that they were connected. No, and then that's what they asked. I'd like to be able to say, oh yeah, now that we know, but I don't think we ever would have made the connection. I mean, certainly we see similarities, but I think because the victimology was very different, and the geography, you can't get much further from, Anchorage, Alaska to Essex Junction, Vermont. I mean, there's about as far apart as you can get in the United States. And I just don't think we ever would have connected them had he not confessed. So that's those are the services we were providing in those cases.
So Robert Palmer from the Broken Systems podcast is asking whether there's a profile that you can mention that was spot on and one that really missed the mark. And I have an idea to get us started on that one. I was just thinking, as you were talking about the original Night Stalker, that similar to Keys, there are a lot of big differences between the early cases and the later cases, including the fact that he wasn't killing anyone in the earlier cases. And I always found it fascinating that you were able to make the connection through other behavioral things. So I don't know whether that was spot on, but I'm guessing it was.
Which one?
D'Angelo. Yeah.
It wasn't, I wasn't 100% right, but there's a great research paper that was done by a professor at the University of Texas who compared all the different profiles that were done over the years on the Golden State Killer, and, trying to compare what was predicted and what was right. And some of it is intangible. You can't really tell, but other ones they could prove right or wrong. Yeah, I know what I got right, and I got most of it right, but I also know where I missed, and it was definitely the age. Right? I mean, I had the age range right, but because I thought he would be younger than he was, I didn't think he would have been old enough to have been in the military. I certainly didn't think he was in the military for various reasons. I didn't think he was in the military at the time he was offending, which a lot of investigators did. But I actually didn't believe he had ever been in the military, but probably had a very strong interest in the military, because and the reason for this was because there's another series that I wasn't aware of that had occurred prior to Visalia. And so I was thinking or interpreting that Visalia is where he started. So I was putting him younger.
Yeah.
And come to find out, there's a whole other series of burglaries that were going on that investigators now believe were probably him. So I think that's where I missed, thinking that he had never been in the military. Now, if I put him a little older, I would have said he might have been in the military. But I like the question. I can answer that because we have two shows coming up that are it's like the third show on our queue right now. And it's a murder out of Union County, New Jersey. And we have one of the detectives on our show, and he told us that our profile was 110% right.
Mm.
So, which is why I had
We
him
need to
on.
work
But
on his math too.
so yeah, that case, it was the murder of Diane Zaleski. She was 54 years old. She was murdered in her home. They had done a significant amount of investigation and brought the case to us after about 8 months. I mean, they had just done so much, and they were just kind of coming up empty-handed. So, like, here, take a look. And so we gave investigative suggestions, but we did an offender profile, and it was like the detective, his words, not ours, 110% right. So I was really happy about that. And I would say that I cannot think of something that we've ever completely missed the mark. I can't. I'm sure there is, like, oh, that was, but there are always elements to things where you're like, oh, I wouldn't have thought that, or sometimes I think where I get surprised by people, like, is when people say, oh, they had no violence in their past, and I'm always like, are you sure? Because they don't offend again. That's
Well, the violence may be criminal, right? It may not
right.
have led to a charge or an arrest.
Right. Yeah. But I can't think of anything really completely missing, where we just had it completely wrong. I mean, there's been times where I'm aware that you say, oh, the offender is most likely a white offender, and they turn out to be a black offender.
So hold on. Robert's asking my favorite question about serial killers. But before we dive into that, I wanted to ask you one thing about the original Night Stalker that I always found interesting. Because we talk about the idea of like serial offenders and, sexual sadists having fantasies. In listening to it and listening to your episodes on it and paying attention to the case, I feel like the burglary was the thing. Uh,
Yes.
Tell me about that, and then we can get to whether Israel Keys was a genius or a lunatic.
So there is, for some burglars, and many serial sexual killers start out as burglars, and there can be a sexual component for some people to burglarize, and going into someone's home and occupying their space and taking their things or moving them around. And so there's this sexual component to it, and it was called sexual burglary. And it's Lou Schlesinger, who is a professor at John Jay College, wrote about it in one of his books. He's one of the books he edited, called Serial Offenders. And when you see burglaries that occur, and there's like maybe symbolic behavior, or behavior that's not necessary for the crime.
Things, but
Yeah.
not necessarily taking things like that.
Right. Or sexual, going through the underwear drawer or something. Some things are obviously sexual, and other things are like, why are they spending so much time here? And
Mhm.
those are the things. So when you start having maybe a series of crimes, let's say there's a serial rapist in the area going into homes, instead of looking at, okay, let's look at somebody who's got sex crime background, let's look at burglars, people who've maybe been stopped for burglary, loitering, trespassing,
Mm.
peeping. So I think when you have people who are going into homes, particularly when the homes are occupied, you have a problem. That is a person that I would be very concerned about, and their future behavior. So I know people have a hard time in, like, relating burglary to a sex crime, but there's a real sense, I think, of taking control from somebody, and
Mhm.
being in their space.
Yep.
And a lot of these crimes are about control.
And I think that idea that anytime a criminal does something that is totally unnecessary, that increases the likelihood of them being caught, but they still need to do it over and over again, you kind of look out for
Right. And that's why I linked the Visalia ransackings. The Visalia ransackings were just a series of burglaries where the offender would go in, ransack the house. It was during the day. Most of the time, people were not home. And it was very intensive, and there were signs that there was a sexual component to these. Particularly, he was going into, underwear, lingerie drawers, and there were some other things going on at the scenes that I thought these are sexual burglaries. And what we noticed about the East Area Rapist was this reliance on burglary and the fact that he spent a lot of the time in the house before any sexual assault at all. He always ransacked the homes first.
Mm.
And I really thought that they were connected. And I think there were many detectives that did not think they were connected, because I think it was too much of a leap to say you went from burglary to sexual assault to murder. But if you really, and these burglary reports were very short. You might get one or two lines in them because they were considered nuisance crimes. Nobody was hurt. Not, there were some things of value stolen, but it was more, he was just messing up people's homes and taking a few things here and there. So they weren't really long reports, but contained within those reports, you'd find these little nuggets of, oh, he took one earring of a pair. And then you'd go and you'd look at, like, maybe, one of the cases in Sacramento where the offender, one of the victims knows he took one earring from a pair. And those were the little things that I was connecting, these little similar things that
Not about
maybe,
burglary. Right.
right, not about burglary, not about financial gain. There's another purpose. And it wasn't that he wasn't gaining, he was taking things of value, but he was also doing these things that just didn't make sense. And some of the behavior was so similar, but there were, these little things were contained in thousands and thousands of pages of reports.
Or
And so you couldn't just say, okay, he's just a burglar here and he's a rapist here, so they're not connected. It really took these, just going through it in very fine detail and, making those connections. And so at the end, I was very certain. I can never say 100%, but I was pretty certain that these were connected. And up until he was arrested, there were some investigators that didn't think that they were connected because they were, the composites were different.
mm.
Never trust composites.
Right. Which we'll get to in a moment. But Keys, genius or lunatic? I tend to think, yeah.
He's not a genius. He was smart. I mean, he's not stupid. He was well prepared. He was smart enough to know, not to at least until the very end, not to commit any crimes where he lived. And I think, moving around geographically certainly was a benefit to him, and he certainly planned well in advance. But we didn't find him to be like this evil genius by any means. And certainly at the end, he wasn't very smart. I mean, he did not even realize that he could be tracked through using a victim's credit card.
Right.
And he was just moving along, and they just
Mhm.
tracked him until a very alert trooper spotted the car, and not that smart. But he thought he was smarter than everybody.
And a lot of what we know about Israel Keys is based on what Israel Keys has told us. So it's really hard to, like, for example, he said, he randomly picked the couriers, but there's so many details there where I'm like, yeah, that one doesn't feel particularly random, or,
There's some randomness in not having a prior relationship with him,
Mhm.
but there's a reason he chose them. I mean, he had his reasons for him. It wasn't completely random. The house looked right to him.
It's
They
located on a corner-ish spot.
exactly. There were some, he certainly had reasons, and that's part of the victim selection process. And he had his process. And so I can't say it was completely random, but the fact that there was no connection to them in prior relationship made it just very difficult to connect him, and likely would have not ever been connected. Well, eventually forensics hopefully would have connected him because but yeah, it was, behaviorally probably
Not
not going to connect them. No.
Yeah. Hard to connect from the BAU perspective
Yeah.
without more. So I wanted to ask you about two cases, the two cases I mentioned before. I wanted to ask you both about, well, first start off with the deaths of Taylor Paschal Placker, who was an 11-year-old, and Skyla, or excuse me, was a 13-year-old, and 11-year-old Skyla Whitaker. They were two best friends who attended a combined fifth grade and sixth grade class at a public school in, I never pronounce it right. It's a Walitka or
Walika.
Walika,
Mhm.
Oklahoma. I do know that it's a creek name for running water, which is interesting because there were so many, streams in this. And the back when they were, I think it was 2011, there were probably about 900 people in the town. The two girls were cheerleaders. They were, really close. The city is very rural. It's like 90 miles east of Oklahoma City, about 70 miles south of Tulsa. And it's like not far, though, from the Muscogee Nation tribe, the Seminole Nation, native reservations. And, the way I've always understood the story, and I may not have the facts perfectly right, is that the two girls go out on a Sunday. I think it was about 5 o'clock on a Sunday. And it's very similar to the Delphi murders of Abby Williams and Liberty Germain, down to the fact that they were both headed toward a bridge. But, they go out on, and that they were just headed out on a walk. They head out on a walk. And, in this case, Skyline and Taylor never make it to the bridge on, I think it was called Bad Creek, that they were headed on. And instead, Taylor's grandfather found them shot multiple times in a ditch on a dusty road, in this town of only 900 or so people, and no real clues about what had happened in the case. I know that they had an early sketch, which I'll show in just one second. But I was just wondering, from your perspective, tell us a little bit about like your involvement in the case. I know it was very early in your BAU space, but go ahead.
Mhm. Well, so this happened. They were murdered on June 8th, 2008. And I heard about it on the news. I was still in Boston. I was not at the BAU yet. And I just thought, what kind of person could kill two little girls like this? And the news was exactly as you reported. They went out for a walk. This is on the same, this was a dirt road. It was on the same road where Taylor lived with her grandparents who had raised her as their own. And she knew her biological mom, but her biological mom was more like a sister to
Hmm.
her. So those were the family dynamics. And I just followed the case in the news, just every now and then checking the news to see, have they caught the killer yet? Who would do this? And then I got to BAU. And as I mentioned, I was assigned to the Crimes Against Adults unit. But as part of our training, we have to work cases in the other units as well. Two cases I think we had to be responsible for. So I did have to do two cases in the Crimes Against Children's unit.
Hmm.
And one day I happened to just look to see if there had been any updates on the case. And I found a news report that the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation was going to be asking for the assistance of the FBI's BAU, because it had been about, I'm trying to think exactly when we got him, but I think it was maybe about 3 years after. So they had done everything that they could up to that point. And I think they're just like, let's just have another set of eyes take a look at it. So I saw that and I asked my supervisor if I could work this case. And he said, well, go down and ask the other supervisor if you could work on this case as part of your training. So I did, and they allowed me to. And I worked the case with another agent in the Crimes Against Children's unit. And it was a little surreal for me to, for these few years wondering what kind of person would do such a thing. And then it became my job to figure that out. So that's how I got involved in it. And the case came in and it was assigned to me. And I spent a lot of time on it. I went out to Oklahoma. I met with the local FBI office, as well as the investigators with the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. They took me out to the crime scene. We spent several days going over the entire case, asking questions. One of the things I asked them to do was we talk about developing victimology. There were a lot of different rumors and, oh, they came across a drug lab and this was a revenge for drug killing, or Taylor's grandfather was involved in drug dealing and this was revenge for that. And so I really wanted to know what's true and what's not true. And none of that was true. I mean, her grandfather was not involved in drug dealing. And so I asked them to give these questionnaires to people that knew the girls, their friends, families, teachers, so that we could get a really good understanding of what risks they had in their lives. Was there somebody who had perhaps a long-standing need for retribution of some sort? And what I learned about them, just to kind of boil it down to, they were very low-risk victims. They both came from good, stable homes with families that adored them. They were very well liked in school. They had a lot of friends. As you mentioned, they were cheerleaders. They also played on the basketball team. They loved the musical, High School Musical. I think it was a movie. They just loved that. So when they were found, they had spent the weekend together at Taylor's house. And the day before, they had walked to the bridge as well. But they had also spent time like writing High School Musical names on their bodies with Sharpies. So they had like Zac Efron's name, and they were just typical girls. They didn't have access
Did you
to.
find them, like, thinking about that? I know you grew up in Oregon and rural area. Did you find them relatable?
I did, because I grew up on a dirt road, and I used to go walk out on that dirt road. I used to go running on the dirt road, and I just felt, wow, I felt so safe out there, and I'm sure they did too. So I always find something to relate to on any case, whether it's a victim themselves that I have something in common with, whether it's we're going to talk about the Phil DiMartino case, but I relate to his sister because I'm a big sister. I always find something I can relate because of a detective. There's always something that you find that gives it meaning to you. There's always something. And this case, obviously, I could relate because I felt like I grew up in a similar area, even though they're in Oklahoma, I was in Oregon. And so they were just very typical, and they didn't have access to cell phones or computers. I mean, Taylor had a cell phone, but all the phone records showed she only texted her grandparents and only called her grandparents. She was not communicating with anybody else. They didn't, they only used computers for homework.
So that's part of how the victimology is narrowing your pool.
Yeah. It just became that they were extremely low risk victims. So what it boiled down to, that the motive for this murder happened on the road that day. Whatever happened that day, and the offender's motive. And so what does that tell us about an offender? I mean, what could these two girls, who were wonderful girls who didn't cause trouble, what could they do to somebody that would cause them to kill them?
How
And
do
so
you
that
Oh, sorry. I
no,
was
I
going
was
to sort of just to that point. How do you then sort of like exclude things? Because I know the way it eventually goes. Like it being a sexually motivated crime. Is it the combination of the crime scene and the victimology?
yeah. And certainly the crime scene played a big portion, not only their victimology, but one of the things, they were shot with two different weapons, both of them. And so the thought was there has to be two offenders. And so that was another question I wanted to answer. There were many questions that I wanted to answer, but one of them, is it one or two offenders? What was the motive for this? Why on this day did they end up dead? Is this a local person or not? So there are all these different things, and then come up with a profile of the offender. And certainly their victimology played a huge part. And obviously I can't rule out everything, but it's all about probabilities. I'm like, okay, I don't see anything in their life. They're about as low risk as you can get. So what happened that day? And what kind of person are we dealing with that somebody feels that they have to kill them? And so I thought you're really dealing with somebody who really has absolutely no empathy for anybody and probably has, the type of personality that they react very quickly and they get upset easily,
And
or
that
they're
whatever it was happened between those corners on that. Yeah.
right. And so the picture starts coming together. And certainly, and I think in this case, my background in forensic science and my background in processing crime scenes really helped because I was able to kind of piece back together using. So I just want to say the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation crime scene team just did a phenomenal job. I mean, the notes that they took, and like I would have a question, I would find somewhere in the notes that somebody wrote it down through their observations of
Mm.
taking notes at the crime scene, and they did a very good job of documenting the crime scene with sketches and photographs, because I'm not there. This, I'm looking at this 3 years later, and the autopsy, and taking into account the the calibers of the weapons, and the placement of the bullets, and trying to piece back together as best I could as to what happened. And what I
And
was able to
told you the
determine,
story of
yeah,
what.
it all starts to come together. And the one thing I was pretty certain about is that the crime could have been committed by one person. You didn't need two people, even though
Mm.
they were shot with two different weapons. Nothing had to have happened simultaneously. It wasn't like one victim was shot with one gun and the other one shot with another gun. It wasn't like that. It was like, so I thought it was like, okay, the offender used one gun on both of them and then one got another gun. And then that's where statistics comes into play. When you have, a double homicide, or multiple weapons used, statistically, does that mean you have two offenders? Does that mean you have one offender? And statistically, we're still looking at one offender, even under these
Mm.
circumstances. So, because there wasn't anything that suggested to me that this had to be two offenders, a probability it was probably one offender. Now, is that 100% accurate? We don't know. I mean, it's the best we can do.
But
Uh,
random, multiple guns, etc.
yeah, I
It
mean, you
tells you
just
something about the person, right? That they happen when you know it's random and they had multiple guns.
yeah. So I came up with a profile. The other thing that was interesting is that when you look at it, and if you're going off the premise, which I was, that the motive was formed that day on the road, that they weren't meeting anybody, there wasn't somebody who was stalking them, going to kill them, or had planned to do this. And what we know is that this was they happened upon each other, and this person had at least two weapons with them at the time of the murder. And so and one of them they knew to be a Glock, and the other was a 22. We don't know what kind, but it was a 22. And so I remember telling during the briefing that I was giving, the verbal briefing of the profile and my observations, I had said, well, this person's a gun nut. And they laughed. They're like, "This is
Isn't everyone in Oklahoma?
this is Oklahoma, ma'am." And I said, "No." I said, I understand that. I grew up in a rural town. I'm not talking about somebody who's got a hunting rifle and his gun rack in the back of his truck. This is not what I'm talking about. This is going to be somebody who is a gun nut, who, that cherishes his guns. He probably brags about them. He practices with them. This is people who know him. I mean, the other thing was he was a very good shot. He shot very quickly. He shot at its high stress situation. He was very accurate. So I thought, this is somebody who knows what they're doing. And people who know him will know he's a gun nut. This
Mm.
isn't just like your normal hunter person, or even a person who's a gun collector. This is somebody who is a little bit wacky about it. And it's not the technical term I use, but just, somebody with a familiarity with guns, who will likely boast and brag about their use of guns, who's probably practices, and who people who know this person will know that he carries around at least two guns all the time, at
Mm.
least. And one of them is a Glock and the other one's a 22. So those were those are some of the things that I was putting on. This is what you're looking for. Obviously, the stuff about the lack of empathy. I definitely thought it was a local person. I did not think, you were talking about the composite. They really had focused on a potential stranger out there. It's,
Oop.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, the shaggy haired stranger that nobody really, I don't know if anyone ever really saw a stranger, but going out, this is where going out there was so critical, was that it is all these series of dirt roads that are numbers. They don't even have names on them. They're just numbered roads. And even in the 911 call, when Taylor's grandmother is calling 911, she's trying to explain to the 911 operator where they're located, and the 911 operator is very confused. But driving out there, I was completely lost. And I thought, there is no way some stranger wandered 3 miles off the interstate to come kill these girls. This is a local person. They probably live pretty close by, which is scary. It's scary in such a small community. And Walika is a small town, but it's also surrounded by other communities like Henrietta. And so it borders other towns that are a little bit bigger, but and the other thing about this road, on the weekends, and this happened on a Sunday, it's used as a cut through by the locals. So it actually gets more traffic on the weekends. Families going to ball games and things like that from one town to another, they cut through on this road. And so I just thought, this is not a stranger. This person is part of the community. And I don't usually say this. I said, you probably already interviewed him as well. He's been stopped. Yeah, they had stopped him. Yeah, because one of the things that they were going through the state trying to interview and talk to anyone who owned a Glock. And he had been contacted, and he had said he sold it or it was stolen. I forget what the story was, but he didn't have it. But they went back, and he actually was one of the many people. That's how thorough their investigation was. It was so thorough that I was pretty sure they had probably talked to him. And I wouldn't normally say that under the circumstances, but because it was such a small area, I figured he's probably one of the people. And when I say small, it's still hundreds and hundreds of leads that they had to cover.
It's Kevin Sweet here. What was his story about what happened? Because I bring it up because there's a question about empathy that's in the chat. And I know he made arguments that made it sound like it was a psychotic episode, but he also killed his fiancée.
Yeah, he had killed his fiancée, and that's how he came on the radar, is that she went missing, and they ultimately found her burned body on his grandfather's property, which was right down the road from where the girls were killed. And but when they interviewed him, it was the same lead detective who was the lead on Taylor and Skyla's murder, and he was interviewing Kevin. He's like, he fits the profile. This is him. I'm convinced it's him. And but what was your question? I'm sorry. Got sidetracked.
What was his story about?
Oh, yeah, that's right. So, he said that he was driving down the road. This is when when the lead investigator was interviewing him about the murders of Taylor and Skyla. He said he was driving down the road. And he saw two monsters coming at him. So he shot them, and then he got back in his car, and they started coming at him again. And so he got another gun and shot them. And he claimed that he had stopped. He had, and I'm going to use his words, he pulled over to take a leak. So the thing about this, even though, he was examined by, psychiatrists, psychologists, and determined not to be crazy. Like he was totally faking this. And, it wasn't a perfect confession in terms of taking complete accountability for what he had done, but he admitted being there. He admitted seeing them. He admitted killing them. And the other thing that was so interesting to me was that the way he described it was exactly the sequence of events that I had come up with in the profiles, that this is how it happened. And this is the sequence of events that occurred in terms of the shooting of who got shot first and who ran, and then he went back and he got another gun and then he shot him again, and only the offender would know that.
Right, right. And
So
that's another way in addition to the gun nut.
yeah, I mean, to be on, to be honest, the investigators didn't need much. They were pretty sure it was him. It wasn't like, oh, this is a big moment. He got the crime scene right. But then, when we go back to the motive, why did this happen? And you're talking about this lack of empathy. So everyone said, oh, nobody knows why he did it. We don't know. And I don't feel that way. I feel like we do know why he did it. So if we go back to what he said, why he was there. I was pulled over to take a leak. Well, what is he really saying? He's saying he exposed himself. He was, or at least he was. I mean, because what is it? What do you have to do if you're going to use the restroom on the side of the
Right.
road? You expose
Certainly,
yourself.
if you were going to pull over,
Yeah, and
take a leak, why would you do it beside two girls?
right, especially it's not like they came around a corner. This is a long road. You can see in both directions. You saw the map. You can see in both directions a long way. He knew they were there. It wasn't like they just happened upon him. So what I believe happened is that he exposed himself to them, and they either threatened they were going to tell on him, or one of I think it was Taylor's sister, who was actually her biological mother. I might have this wrong, but they had a close family member that had worked with him at a fast food restaurant. And so there may be one of them, Taylor may have recognized him and said something. I don't know. But at some point, I think he felt like I've done this. They're going to tell on me, whether they said they were, or he perceived that they were, or they've recognized me. And I think that is the motive. I think that he exposed himself to them, and then he felt like, I can't let them go back to the house and tell anybody what just happened. So he killed them.
Him telling this psychotic story is either malingering for defense or some kind of shame he felt, or
I think it's kind of, I don't know if it's shame in terms of like how we would normally feel shame.
Normal shame. Yeah.
Yeah. But when, we listened to jail calls of his, and they would send them to me. And at the time, it was prior to, he's been charged at this point with the murder of his fiance. Her name was Ashley Taylor. And he has not been charged with the murder of Tyler or Skyla, but his mother tells him on one of the phone calls, they're going to charge you with the murder of those two little girls. And his response to her is, what is this going to do to my reputation?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Right.
I mean, talk about, this kind of self-centered lack of empathy. I mean, you name it. He has no regard for anybody but himself. And it's not even his regard for his future, or what have I done? It's like, what is it going to do to my reputation? I mean, and really to think he had all that great of a reputation to begin with just kind of tells you that he's got this kind of, he's not really all there in terms of realistically taking a look at himself and who he really is.
So we've got Sophie asking, which I don't know whether you have the answer to this question. I have my own thoughts on it. Do you think people can learn or develop empathy?
I don't know that I'm qualified. I mean, just from my own experience and maybe my cynical view of the world, no.
Yeah, no.
But I mean, I'm just not. I really don't know. But I'm just going to say I don't think so. I don't think somebody who does something like this ever can learn to develop true empathy.
Yes, that's exactly it. So, I think I would put it in two buckets. I think you can learn empathetic behaviors. And that can be a very good thing in the sense that if you've made the commitment, like, I am not empathetic, but I want to function in this world, or I want to be good to people, or whatever it is, you can learn and mimic empathetic behaviors. And we see this in a lot of sort of like neurodiversity situations with clients. But I also think on the other hand of it, you could be a totally non-empathetic person in this, I guess, this empathy that we're talking about, where it's primary and it's about caring, and you can mimic those behaviors. But then I think there's this other piece that empathy is almost too broad of a concept because I do think in some ways serial killers are empathetic if you look at the definition of they can read other people's emotions. They certainly can, but they don't respond with the caring response. They respond with this other response. So, in a weird way, I think what it really is, can we make people care? I don't think so.
No.
I don't think we can make you care.
Yeah. And I think I've changed my thoughts on empathy, or I used to think and not really knowing, because we were talking about this before we started recording, getting into the mind of somebody. I don't
Mm,
really believe I can do that. I can try to understand why they did it, but I'll never know how they feel. And I used to have this sense that they have no feeling at all. They just don't care at all. But actually, after hearing, it's actually Carrie Rawson, who is the daughter of Dennis Rader, who
mhm.
is known as BTK, and she has talked about, well, I should say I've seen some of the things that she's discussed regarding her father, about he had a lot of feelings.
Yeah,
And so you can learn a lot from people who, have grown up or lived with, these types of offenders, where you think they don't care about anything, but sometimes they really do. A lot of that can be internalized. So like somebody like Kevin Sweat, I think he has a lot of emotion, a lot of feeling,
yeah.
but it's all like turned inward. Like, why is this poor me, me, me? But he probably has a lot of these feelings of this overwhelming, things are being done to me all the time, So I don't know that to be a fact, but I just want to say I used to think people had no feelings. And I think that maybe I was wrong about that. They probably do have a lot of feelings,
Actually,
but
probably in some ways, too many. I mean, like an
maybe.
overwhelming amount. I remember this one client that I had who, he at one point, wild story. Well, so he became my client because one day in school, he took a keyboard on a computer, like those old school with the thick keyboards, and smashed it against the back of another kid's head so hard that keys were stuck in his head, like when they pulled it away. And apparently, this guy had offended him a year before, and he waited and he sat on it for a year and did this. Fast forward much later, this kid is robbed in a drug deal. He walks to the house of the kid who set him up, rings the doorbell. His 13-year-old sister comes down and says her brother isn't there. And he's like, okay. And then she walks up the stairs and he starts firing bullets into the door and almost hits her, right? So stone, unbelievably, unbelievably cold. Clearly psychopathic behaviors. But he genuinely cared about things like dogs and his sister and animal welfare, almost cared about things too much. It intensely affected him. And I just thought to myself, it's about where that emotion is focused more than
Yeah.
whether you, yeah.
And I think it could be dependent on the individual. Some people probably have no emotions
Mhm.
or feelings, and other people have a lot of feelings. And these, like, as we call them, injustice collectors, everything they perceive is being done to them or happening to them when it's really not. So you have these people that have these overwhelming feelings, and I think you just deal with different people all the time, and you really don't know. You have to look at a case by case basis. At least somebody like me does. The experts in psychology, they probably have a better global view, but for me, it's just about looking at an individual case. And certainly I am not qualified to diagnose anybody. I just look at the characteristics. Some of those characteristics may be in line with certain kind of personality disorders, but it's not for me to diagnose. And I don't try to. Do I think certain offenders might be high on the narcissistic list, or this narcissism scale, or the psychopathy checklist? Yes. But until they're officially analyzed by an expert and run through all the battery of tests, we don't really know for sure.
And it's like Bob said, Bob Drew, your co-host, once you've seen a serial killer, you've
If
seen
you've
one.
seen one serial killer, you've seen one serial killer. I completely agree with that. we hear a lot of like, these guys do this, these guys do that. I think there's a lot of characteristics they have in common, but like I said, you get asked a lot of questions. What about this guy? What about this guy? And I'm like, I'd really have to look at the case because
Mhm.
the cases that I have worked on, when you look at, like, for example, looking at Dennis Rader versus Joe D'Angelo, they're different.
Mhm.
They both did
Yeah.
terrible things. They both killed a lot of people, but they are different. And I can cite many reasons how they're different. And I'm sure Joe D'Angelo is different from, the Long Island serial killer. And we see differences there. We see differences between many of these offenders and
There's a part of us internally that wants to have a template. So when we see that guy on the street who does X, Y, or Z, then we
yeah.
can. But that's
Yeah. You just can't. I'm convinced there's some similarities. All have some similar characteristics, but there are also some, they're very different. I once heard somebody prior to Joe D'Angelo being arrested, and there was a special on the case before it was solved, and it was a retired profiler saying that when they catch the Golden State Killer, he'll talk because they all want to talk. And knowing the case and knowing how he behaved, I thought he's not going to talk. He's not like that. He's not a talker. He's not
Mhm.
somebody who is going to sit and brag about his crimes the same way other offenders who enjoy talking. Never any until this day he hasn't talked. And he's different.
In next week's episode, we'll discuss the unsolved killing of 36-year-old Phil DiMartino, a gay man who was killed in his San Francisco apartment, the Zodiac case, the Lewis Clark Valley serial killer case, and answer more listeners' questions. If you'd like to join us for more discussions with us and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners like the one you just listened to, you can join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. We'll see you all again next week.